This is the Overton Pod. Hello, Kanthan.
And a very good morning to you, John.
How's it going?
I'm just marveling at living in the era of the transgender monkeys.
The transgender monkeys. Tell us more about the transgender monkeys.
Yeah, I think it's a great way to start because it segues into the entire discussion that we're going to be having in terms of the seismic shift that was triggered by the spectacular victory that Donald Trump
What
has
they're
brought.
calling the greatest comeback in political history.
Absolutely. And so the perspective shift that we need to start with, okay, is that the GDP of South Africa is roughly 377 billion US dollars.
Yep.
Okay, that's the entire productive capacity of our country. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the US government, okay, spent 516 billion in unauthorized transactions over the past year.
Unauthorized transactions.
Okay, yeah,
This is what we get called. What gets called irregular expenditure.
But the stuff that kind of leapt out at me, they spent 33 million US dollars on transgender monkey research. Okay,
To prove what?
well. And more to the point, they also spent 2.7 million to study Russian cats walking on a treadmill.
Amazing.
Yeah,
But only Russian ones, of course.
Only Russian ones, yeah.
That's incredible.
The Department of Defense ruined 170 million of military equipment by leaving it outside. Mm-hmm. The U.S. Agency for International Development spent $5 million to promote tourism in Europe.
Yeah.
Okay. And they also gave...
But only 5 million for tourism in Europe.
Yeah,
This
and
is
they
why
also-
Americans don't leave America.
And they also gave 200 million to music artists like Chris Brown, Lil Wayne, Post Malone. This is through the COVID Paycheck Protection Program. I'm amazed that this thing is still running. And they bought soap dispensers for aircraft at 50 times the commercial price.
Soap dispensers for aircraft. So this is the same as the mops they bought for Eskom.
Yeah, very similar. Yes.
At like 400% markup or whatever it
Yep.
was, or 4,000% markup.
Yeah.
Just a reminder to everyone that our corruption is not unique, right? And our idiocy in government is
No,
not unique.
it makes us look incredibly inefficient. I mean, you now look at Serafina too,
yes.
and we are such goddamn amateurs. How does this happen?
This is actually the point I'm getting to, which is that our government is inept and corrupt, but they haven't quite honed in on making it so brilliantly inept and so brilliantly corrupt that they give the veneer of being competent, which people think the United States government is, while actually spending giant amounts of money on soap dispensers and transgender monkeys and Russian cats on treadmills. It's quite fascinating.
But $516 billion, that's 1.5 times the GDP of South Africa. My word.
Yeah, so let's talk about America, because that's going to be the topic of this podcast. I suppose if you're not into American politics, you can bail out now, but I can't understand how you wouldn't be, because really they do set the tone for the world. The way they govern, like it or don't like it, sets the tone for the world, sets the direction. Who is in power very much sets the tone, as we can see with things already shifting following the results of the American election, even though Trump is not in power and Joe Biden is still in power and Kamala Harris is still in power.
Joe Biden's on the beach. Let's be very clear about that.
Well, I have to say, but in about 4 years, I've never seen Joe Biden as peppy as he was when he came to give that speech after Trump won the election. Let's go back a little bit though, because I don't want to skip over stuff. We've got a lot of questions to answer. This podcast is going to be very much driven by the feedback we've received from audience in terms of the questions we've been asked, and then taking those questions and letting those direct where we go. But I do just want to talk quickly about that election, about the victory, and about our sort of personal takes on it. So, recap, if you have been buried in a hole like Saddam Hussein for the last week, Donald Trump wins the election in really historic fashion. So firstly, he won the popular vote, which they weren't meant to be able to do, according to pretty much everyone. It was a running joke on late night television in the US that, the Democrats always win the popular vote, which has also been an argument of the Democrats for quite some time now.
Well, it's the main reason the Democrats have wanted to scrap the Electoral College.
Yes, one man, one vote, Kanthan.
Yes.
Yeah. So I don't want to get too much into the weeds on the Electoral College, but yes. So Donald Trump wins the popular vote, firstly, by somewhere between, at this stage, remember, California is still counting. But where are we? A week after the elections. California is still counting. But he wins it by about 4 million votes, 5 million votes. He then wins the presidency. He wins the Electoral College by 312 electoral votes, which in the modern era, in this sort of 21st century era where things have become quite polarized and you don't see big swings in a lot of states. So the whole idea of swing states never used to be as patent as it is now. Any state could really be a swing state. But now there's certain states that used to be swing states are not anymore. Florida being one example. He absolutely routs her in the Electoral College. He wins the Senate majority of 52, probably should be 54.
It should be 54, but there were two elections that were stolen.
Yeah, so we
And
can get
look,
onto
I think we're at the stage now where we can openly talk about the fact that the 2020 election was stolen.
Yeah, I want to talk about that because the Overton window, I saw it shifting in real time.
Yes.
It's unbelievable. I actually haven't seen an Overton window shift like that ever before. But yeah, so he wins the Senate. Congress is also won, so the Republicans narrow, 220 roughly, so they have about a 20 vote margin or a 15 vote margin. And it's still, again, the still race is not fully called. So this is why it's quite hilarious a week later. It's only from Democrat states. A reminder that Florida counted about 10 million votes in the space of 2 hours and 45 minutes. California took a week and is still not fully complete.
They're still busy printing ballots, John. You have to understand how this works.
Yeah. All right. So an incredible victory. If you listened to our podcast before, we said Donald Trump should win, but whether he will win was questionable. It very much looks like there was shenanigans in Wisconsin where he still won, but it looked like there was a massive ballot dump in the middle of the night again. That sort of
which is what tipped the Senate, and also there was a very similar thing that happened in Arizona.
Yes.
Which again tipped the Senate away from Kerry Lake.
Yeah.
Now you have this unbelievable scenario where the entire state votes overwhelmingly for the Republican, but suddenly in terms of the Senate, there's mysteriously an extra number of votes that pitches up enough to tip it in favor of the Democrat.
Yeah, and so it's the idea of split voting. And the problem in this election is that nowhere else did anyone split vote. So in other words, if they voted for Trump as president, they voted down ballot for all the Republicans. So, and if they voted for Kamala, they voted down ballot for Democrats. So nowhere else were people splitting ballots. And you can see that in the numbers. But somehow in Arizona, people split their ballots. So a bit weird. But I want to talk about the victory. I want to talk about a man who was demonized pretty much since he came down that escalator in 2015. He stood there and said, we need to do something about the border. We need to do something about the rapists and murderers coming over. And the first hoax began, which is that he called all Mexicans murderers and rapists. And that was the start of it. And of course, he's been compared to Hitler more times than anyone can really count. He's been on the cover of every major periodical that you can think of, Time, Vogue, etc., pretty much depicted as Hitler. German publication, Der Spiegel, has depicted him as Hitler. He ran.
We're talking about the same Germany where the government has fallen this week. Is that what we're talking about?
Yes, we must. I think next podcast we'll get onto all the stuff that's going on globally. I think somewhat as a fallout as a result of all of this, but I think a man demonized, a man who had a 4-year term which was partially taken away from him in the sense that he was accused for over 2 years of having been a Russian asset, which was completely disproven. Something that the Washington Post received a Pulitzer Prize for, which was completely, as they would call it, mis and disinformation.
Let's call it for what it is, which is lies.
Yes, absolutely. Complete and utter lies. And he ran a 4-year term, which obviously people disagreed with certain things. They disagreed with, again, another hoax, the Muslim ban, not a Muslim ban, just a ban on 7 countries where the majority happens to be Muslim. He left the other 50 countries that are Muslim alone. Just hoax after hoax, issue after issue, and he governed okay. I mean, there were issues where people would have disagreed, but he was fine. He wasn't Hitler. He wasn't anything dictatorial, frankly.
Look, actually, he governed more than fine, because if you look in terms of real incomes for the majority of Americans, they went up for the first time in 20 years.
It was more than 20. I think it was
Yes.
like 35 or something like that.
Yeah. So across the board, for the first time, you had literally Americans with more money in their pockets, and they were more prosperous. And so today you get all of this talk from the Biden administration that, the economy has never performed better. The Biden administration added more than 400,000 jobs into government, which is what pushed the employment numbers to where they are right now. And more to the point, if you take a look in terms of the economic growth figures and plot those against the inflation figures, the country has actually gone backwards.
Yes, absolutely. So he has what I would, I'm trying to be as neutral as possible in this description, but I would consider it a very successful term.
But, there's nothing that's not objective about actually quoting directly what
facts and figures, right?
the inflation figures are. And yes.
And he ends his term with the Abraham Accords, which, again, fact and figure, Israel has less enemies in the Middle East, which is a positive thing because less people who want to kill each other, Israel versus them and them versus Israel. So there's those things. Manufacturing numbers improve. So he improved manufacturing jobs, about 250,000 increased manufacturing jobs while he's there. There were a whole bunch of markers which were positive. Obviously, then COVID happens. COVID gets used as a very effective tool to oust him from power. And we both, we'll get on to the 2020 election. We both feel that there were certainly shenanigans there. And he then gets taken out of office. January 6th happens. Another hoax, in my opinion. Essentially, no one on the non-Trump side dies. So you're told that a whole bunch of police officers were killed. They weren't. You're told that the people who went into the Capitol, that there was this terrible riot and they were very violent, and that it was an insurrection. But no one was armed. And there was basically no violence. There were people walking around in places they shouldn't have been walking around, but that was pretty much it.
But remember, part of the reason why they were walking around where they shouldn't be walking around is because there were FBI agents who were disguised as Trump supporters who actually unlocked doors for them and invited them to go in a particular direction.
So it very much looks like a psyop. In other words,
it was a
operational
psyop. And at the point at which you had the FBI before Congress and they were asked, how many undercover agents did you have on the ground posing as Trump supporters?
As part of the crowd.
As part of the crowd. And the answer was, well, I cannot give you the figure. And the response was...
I'm unable to give you that information.
I'm unable to. And the response was, the answer should have been no. There were none.
Yes, exactly. So all right. So that all happens. The guy then is taken out of power very unceremoniously because after January 6th, you've got people leaving his administration in inverted commas disgust. He gets kicked off Twitter. He gets kicked off Facebook. So the guy is excommunicated from society. This is the most powerful man in the world for those last 14 days. He's, by all accounts, at least up until COVID, a successful president by many metrics, and he's not the Hitler he was claimed to be. Okay, he's been mistreated. His wife, who is a former model, is the first lady not on the cover of Vogue in pretty much forever. I think since before Jackie Onassis, and then he's out of power. And he goes away And he really does go away. I mean, you know, the idea that there wasn't the Democrats like to talk about a peaceful transition of power. A peaceful transition of power occurred. The only thing that Trump refused to do was to be on the stage on the 20th of January and be sitting there while Biden was sworn in, because he felt that there was something illegitimate about the 2020 election. But he leaves and he goes and he buggers off to Mar-a-Lago, and that's it. It's over. And the Democrats can't let it go. They can't let it go. So what they do is they start finding places to prosecute Trump and prosecuting Trump in every district they can, but never in any of the districts where they might lose. Only in districts where they'll have juries that'll be on their side, where if you go look at the voting trends, it's 60, 70, 80, 90% of those communities have voted against Trump. Right? So you've got places like Manhattan. You've got places like Fulton County in Georgia. You've got the one they couldn't get right, where they had to prosecute in Florida. But they did try prosecute in an area that was more Democrat. The only problem they had was they got a judge who, in inverted commas, is a Republican. Okay, but they go and they prosecute the guy. And the intention, they openly state, the intention is to prosecute him and to put him in prison. That's what they want to do. This is the former president of the United States being prosecuted so that they can put him in prison. Now, this has never happened before. Now, you may say, well, this is well-deserved because Trump did things that he wasn't allowed to do, except for the fact that, let's take the Florida case as an example. He had confidential documents. Presidential Records Act says that presidents are allowed to declassify documents by looking at them and going, this is now declassified. And so they're accusing him of having classified documents.
More to the point, he had these classified documents.
Yes.
Joe Biden had classified documents while he was vice president.
Which he wasn't allowed to have.
And which he wasn't allowed, because only the president can declassify documents.
That's correct. So Joe Biden has the documents, comes out. Mike Pence has documents like this, also vice president. Of course, Mike Pence didn't say anything. Joe Biden didn't say anything until such a time as they were prosecuting Trump. And then they were like, okay, we better tell the authorities that we have these documents. And so that's the one example. The other example is he phoned the Georgia Secretary of State and governor and said, find me 12,000 votes, because that was the difference. He didn't say steal. He didn't say fake it. He said, there's got to be 12,000 votes that we've missed. But they thought that was a crime. That, by the way, may have proceeded actually to before the election. They may have got a guilty verdict against him. Very, very much it would have been a jury that would have been against Trump. But the prosecutor couldn't help herself from sleeping with her co-counsel and from basically sullying all of the evidence against Trump. And then, of course, the co-counsel goes to the White House to consult with the Biden administration. So it looks like collusion. They claim it wasn't, but why was he going there for an independent trial, right? So these are the things. Manhattan, I mean, the stuff that went on in Manhattan, we've got the E. Jean Carroll case, which is just crazy. I mean, I think one of the questions was to go into that, the E. Jean Carroll
thing. But the crucial thing that's emerged from this entire process is that at every single step of the way,
yes,
Trump has fought it off and he has won.
Yes, except the E. Jean Carroll one.
Yes.
And the ruling against him with regards to the loan he took for Mar-a-Lago, against Mar-a-Lago,
yes,
as security. But that looks like, so that one looks like it. So that one quickly, I think we've discussed before, but essentially took a loan to do development. And he said, look, I'll give Mar-a-Lago as collateral. They said, all right, what's Mar-a-Lago worth? He said something to the effect of $200 million. Or 125 or whatever it was at the time. I don't remember the exact number. The bank looked at it and went, we don't really think Mar-a-Lago is worth that, but we know you and we know you'll pay back your debts essentially, so we'll give you the loan. The loan was given against the collateral. He paid the loan back with interest. There were no aggrieved parties whatsoever, but the state decided that Mar-a-Lago was only worth 25, and so he was lying.
Well, they decided it was only worth 25 until the point at which they decided to fine him $500 million.
Yes.
And they said, well, he can use Mar-a-Lago as collateral because it's worth that much.
Yeah.
It's
crazy.
So the levels of rampant corruption on the part of these Democrat-run districts,
Yes.
I must say, is phenomenal. There's
So
no
they go
yeah.
after this man, and they get eventually they get what they really want, which is they get that felony conviction, right? The felony conviction, which was the Stormy Daniels trial, and that is the one where before the election he signs a non-disclosure agreement with Stormy Daniels, pays her $250,000 to not disclose anything about him. Okay, he still denies anything happened between them. To be honest, if you go look at the transcript from the trial in terms of what's stated from his side about what actually happened, I actually believe him, frankly, because it's just credible, and her story isn't. But I know people believe he slept with Stormy Daniels. Fine, if you want to believe that, believe that. I personally don't, based on actually having read that story. However, he then. It gets written not by him, but by an accountant in a ledger, as we paid Stormy Daniels $250,000. But because it was paid, and then the jury is now told you must see this as a campaign contribution, there's some sort of intimation that he's violated some sort of electoral law. I'll add that in the trial they wouldn't let the most renowned expert on electoral finance law testify, and they never told the jury exactly what Trump was charged with criminally. Anyway, a jury that voted 90% against Trump in an election twice then finds him guilty. And of course, that it makes him that one entry into the ledger becomes 34 felonies. Okay. And the left gets what they want. So now we get to the point where we're 2 years, a year and a half away, and we've got all these trials against him. And now we've got a felon. And we've got what we want to say, because that's our tagline every time we talk about Donald Trump on MSNBC or CNN. Convicted felon Donald Trump running for the US presidency again. Okay. And they've got what they want. And so this continues throughout the thing, and primaries happen. And of course, we've got some good people running against him, Ron DeSantis being the big one. Some people like Nikki Haley. I'm not a big fan personally, but I get it. Some people like her. She's very much 2000s Republican. She's a George Bush Republican. And yeah, that happens. And then he routs all of them in the primary. And there's a bit of wailing and screaming, and how can a felon be the nominee? And then we get to the point at which he gets shot. And it's very clear that if you believe that that was a state action, in other words, it wasn't a lone gunman, he was put up to it in some way, and there seems to be a lot of evidence, which we've discussed before. Please do go listen to the other podcasts if you haven't. There seems to be evidence that that could have been a state action, but let's say it wasn't. Let's say it's what they say it was, what the FBI says it was. It was just a lone gunman. The reality is that at that point, 8 years, you'd had a media complex and Democrat Party calling the man Hitler, saying he was a threat to democracy, saying he was going to destroy the United States of America, saying he was all the worst things, and at the same time an idiot, a moron, So he's both a Hitler-level kind of dictatorial genius, but he's also an idiot and a moron with no insight onto anything. And so the lone gunman now comes and shoots him, which is an inevitable outcome, because you've told people that this very, very terrible man is going to destroy life as you know it, right? So he gets shot. We then have a whole bunch of conspiracy theories around that in terms of he didn't actually get shot, Kanthan. It was fake blood. So he gets shot, fortunately, in the ear, something that even people who aren't religious would probably describe as a miracle. The guy turned his head 0.3 seconds, I think, before the bullet hit his ear. So it's not like he heard it coming, saw it coming. He just happened to go like this as the guy fired. Hits the corner of his ear. Very mildly injured, obviously. Goes down. The whole thing happens. Everyone knows about that. Subsequent to that, there's another attempt on his life by someone who's clearly motivated by the Democrat complex. This is a guy who went to Ukraine to fight for Ukraine. who has been in contact with a whole bunch of Democrats and a whole bunch of media.
And clearly received lots of funding.
Right. And then we get to the Republican National Convention, and really a very, very good Republican National Convention. Lots of energy. Trump had just been shot, so there's that. He appoints J.D. Vance as his VP, and most people go, what the hell are you doing, dude? J.D. Vance isn't going to make more people vote for you. Those people in those southern states were already going to vote for you. A lot of the Appalachian sort of states and people, one or two states, but in terms of the people that identify culturally there, we're going to vote for you anyway. So what are you doing? And J.D. Vance, and then, of course, the talking point. J.D. Vance is weird, Kanthan. He's weird. So, and so there's a lot of talk about that. They have a very
And they made up that story about the sofa.
Yeah, they made up the story about the sofa, which went viral. Of course, the Republican National Convention is very successful, but this is all the stuff that happens. And then there's a debate. And at this point, the Republican National Convention looks amazing. Trump's just been shot. He's riding on a wave of a high. Elon Musk has come out and endorsed him. Mark Zuckerberg, who funded their 2020 election against him, has turned around and gone, that's really badass to be shot, go down, come up, and the first thing you sort of do is go fight. And not knowing whether you're dying, right? Whether there's another shooter, whether, you just don't know. And so they're riding on a wave. He has the debate with Joe Biden, and suddenly Joe Biden gets swapped out because Joe Biden is a plant on television. He's a house plant. And Trump destroys him. And next thing that happens, Joe Biden gets swapped out. It's not meant to be Kamala. It's not meant to be her. Nancy Pelosi comes out this past week and makes another comment which shows that it was not meant to be her. It was meant to go to an open primary. And my take is still Jill Biden using Twitter, endorsed Kamala. And the problem is, once that had happened from the president's account, it was too hard to take it back. And now Kamala is the nominee. And suddenly there's a wave of optimism about Kamala. There's a picture on, was it Time magazine, of Kamala with a coconut and palm trees. I don't really get the whole thing, but it was meant to be this wave of optimism about Kamala.
The word you're looking for is joy.
Joy.
You were meant to feel the joy.
And vibes. Mm-hmm. Right. And then the Democratic National Convention happens. They have a truck outside where you can get permanently sterilized. If you're a man, if you're a woman, you can book your abortion. So that happened.
But you need ID to get in. Let's be very clear.
Yes, you need ID to get into the Democratic National Convention, but they're very much against ID for voting on election day. And that she has a bit of a bump. She goes from being the most disliked vice president in modern history to being allegedly ahead of Trump in the polls. Everyone loves her all of a sudden.
I spoke at length about those polls and and how those polls were actually being rigged on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, for manipulation purposes.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So that brings us to the present.
So that's a long summary.
Yeah, so let's now focus on the way forward, where we're going to.
So how do you feel post this election?
So remember the conversation that we had was, it was very clear to me that if the election was not stolen, then Trump was going to win by a huge majority.
Yep.
And fortunately, the strategic thing that the Republicans did was they said we need to make this too big
to rig.
To be able to rig, yes, exactly, which is pretty much what they did. So just the sheer numbers this time round meant that even in those swing states, they were not able to do the level of manipulation that went down last time. And so some of the stuff that Musk did, particularly in terms of mobilizing ground forces in Pennsylvania, and then more to the point, you had one of the gay Trumpers. And I'm putting this out there significantly because everyone has this view that Trump is anti-gay rights. Okay, but you have one of the gay Trumpers who then makes it his singular course to go and mobilize the Amish vote.
He moved and lived there, Scott Presler.
Yeah. So he moved, so he very specifically went out to mobilize the Amish vote. And Why were the Amish willing to turn out and vote for Trump when they have a historical record of not voting at all? Well, it's because the Democrats were messing with their way of life. The Amish just want to be left alone. They want to get on with their lives. They want to keep their farms. They want to keep their raw
Yeah, then
milk.
they don't engage with the system, but they don't expect the system to engage with them either.
Yes. And so that was, so 150,000 Amish in Pennsylvania that suddenly were turning out for Trump. And if you look in terms of the margins of victory, well, I say victory in inverted commas, from Biden versus Trump the last time around, that 150,000 in of itself was enough to completely swamp that that advantage that Biden purportedly had in the previous election. So, look, but all told, I think the most crucial lesson that we need to take from this is that eventually the American public stopped believing the lies.
Yeah.
And there were just too many reasons.
Absolutely
There were
this.
just too many reasons why it became clear. So simple things like, why is Trump getting charged for confidential documents, but Joe Biden is not getting charged for confidential documents? Why are they going after Trump, but they're not going after Hunter Biden? Why? There are just so many of these things that we can keep tossing back and forth. It was very clear that there was systematic lawfare against Trump. And even people who don't necessarily like the guy, they turned around and said, this is not who we are as Americans. This is not who we are as a people. This is not how we should be running our country. And I think a lot of the vote that actually turned out in Trump's support was precisely because I think that the Americans, when you get down to it, have a fundamental sense of fairness. Because this is a country that was built on being a meritocracy. And
the rule of law and order.
Yes. And when you see that those core values that define the society are being so subverted in order to just be vindictive against a guy who pretty much just wanted to be left alone after those elections, they were not prepared to actually take that anymore. And it was also very clear to them that the process by which Harris was put into that candidacy was not a democratic process.
I agree with that. I want to talk, because this is where I think the election changed, is the idea that the lies don't stick anymore, the hoaxes, the misinformation, the disinformation, the lies, they don't stick anymore. I think most people in the States, obviously there's unfortunately so much propaganda in global media, but most people realize what January 6th actually wasn't an insurrection. And in fact, it was an operation just to delegitimize Trump.
Well, one of the things that actually pointed out that January 6th was this operation to delegitimize Trump was the comparison between what happened in January 6th and the BLM riots, for which there were no one prosecuted.
Yeah.
And so the patent unfairness of that, where you very clearly had destruction of public property, people dying, no prosecutions. And you have January 6th, where you have unarmed people, no destruction of public property, and yet people have ended up going to jail.
Yeah.
And the sentences that they were served for just being present without any sign of any violence or any destruction of property, 2 to 3 years in jail. People have been sent off. And of course, Trump has promised to pardon every single one of them on the very first day that he's in office.
Absolutely. So I think that's one of the hoaxes. Another one of the hoaxes, it was a question asked by one of our listeners or viewers, was about, and I'm just trying to see if I can find it here, but essentially, so Camille Pert said, Obama repeated the good folks on both sides hoax just before the election. But I actually think that backfired on Obama, because I think at that point most people knew that the good folks on both sides was a lie. And he just wants us to tease apart the hoax with the full speech and the miscommunication. So, look, what I will tell you...
I must tell you, I felt a crushing disappointment at the time. so most of my writings are still out there on the web, on my website on kanthanpillay.com, and so there are positions that I've taken over the years where my views have shifted based on the fact that new information came to light. And the intelligent thing to do is that when you have new information, then you revise your position. You don't just double down. And to a large extent, I always thought that Obama was better than that, because certainly he was incredibly manipulative. He did, to a large extent.
Very talented politician.
Yeah, incredibly talented politician. But this is the first time that he blatantly lied on a public platform. And when you looked at his face as he was doing it, there was none of the vigor that used to be in his look and in his step that had been there for the longest time. He was looking defeated, but he still parroted out this lie that had been debunked by left-wing sources as well.
Yeah, so Snopes.
Yes.
So I'm not going to we're not going to spend too much time on it, but if you still think that in the protests, and just to remind you what those protests were about, they wanted to remove statues. This is a South African gift to the Americans. The background of this is that this comes from Rhodes Must Fall. And Rhodes Must Fall was about removing the Rhodes statue, amongst other things. That then spread within about 18 months at the time to the UK, at which time they wanted Rhodes to fall at the UK. And that conversation then spread to the United States about their past heroes and those statues. And so the left glommed onto this and, of course, now wanted to remove all the statues of anyone who came before. So Robert E. Lee being one of them, because he was on the Confederate side of the Civil War. But also Trump said, if you go after people like Robert E. Lee, who was a hero for a lot of people in the country, he was on the wrong side, but we united. We are the United States. And he's well acknowledged even by generals who were against him to have been an incredibly effective and intelligent military operator. So he said, if we go after Robert E. Lee, we're going to end up going after Abraham Lincoln and George Washington, etc. And in fact, Trump was correct. During Biden's term, they started removing statues of Jefferson and Washington from prominent places, museums in New York. Okay, and there'd been a protest and a counter-protest. The left, we want the statues gone because these people were slave owners. Newsflash: everyone in the 1700s was a slave owner. And then there were people on the other side. There were neo-Nazis there, but there were also other people protesting for, just normal people saying, look, don't take our statues away. And then obviously the well-known tiki torch, 200 people or whatever with tiki torches, white supremacists. And in a news conference afterwards, Trump had said that in terms of the argument, there were fine people on both sides. So the people who say the statue should go because these were slave owners, and the people who say the statue should stay because this is history. And these people.
Then he added, and I'm not talking about.
And then he added within the very same clip, I am not talking about neo-Nazis and white nationalists who should be condemned totally. Those were his exact words. And unfortunately, they cut out the second part. And
it was not unfortunately; it was deliberate.
It was deliberate, but unfortunately for the purposes of informing people. But I really believe that all of these hoaxes have started to fall apart, and I'm more interested in discovering and chatting about why that is, because I think it's a complete failure and a collapse of media. I've had more than one person say to me, I don't like Trump, and I really didn't think good things of him, but I listened to him on Rogan. I listened to that Joe Rogan podcast, and I was quite surprised. And then I'll say, well, what were you, and I don't think as badly of him anymore. And I will be like, okay, well, what were you surprised by? Well, I was always told that he was stupid and he didn't know anything about anything. But on Rogan, he spent like 15 minutes talking deeply about tariffs, from a point of knowledge. Now, you may still disagree on tariffs in and of themselves, but he clearly knows what they are and what they do and how they function. He spoke about the deficit. He spoke about American history. He spoke about topics in depth. He spoke about the border and how you have to police the border. He spoke about being a strongman with strongmen, Putin and Xi, and Kim Jong. And so a lot of people have been shifted by that. And I wonder how many people have been shifted by the fact that the access, and you cannot underplay what Elon Musk has done with Twitter, now X, in terms of people being able to access a variety of information, being able to piece together the information they feel most represents the truth, okay, and then being able to make up their own reality as a result of that.
So I think that certainly Musk buying out Twitter was a significant step. But if you really want to get down to brass tacks in terms of Trump's popularity, you just simply have to look at the entirely grueling schedule that this guy had in terms of rallies across the entire country. Pretty much now going on 2 years.
Yeah.
Where every single state he visited, he held a rally, and he spoke to people, and he just speaks off the cuff for hours at a time. The guy is unstoppable in terms of his ability to read a crowd and to actually carry them with him. I mean, the guy goes and holds a rally in the Bronx,
Yeah.
okay, which is one of the bluest areas of New York. This is AOC's territory, okay? She's not able to get people to pitch up to a school meeting. Okay, he ends up with this incredible rally where there's lines stretching kilometers away just to get in and hear him speak. And Trump did this for the entire course of the 2 years that he was campaigning. Even on the days that he was doing these incredibly long interviews. So, immediately after doing the interview with Joe Rogan, he immediately gets on a plane, goes to another rally.
In fact, I think he did 2 further rallies that day. And I think important to also say is that he didn't have canned speeches at the rallies.
He never does.
So sometimes there's a teleprompter and there's like points on the teleprompter, but if you watch the rally, he just riffs.
Yes,
and
constantly.
He apparently has said that he never wants to treat the crowd with disrespect, essentially, by giving them a canned speech. So he feels that he owes them to just be genuine in the moment. So, yes, the talking points are roughly similar. Obviously, it's an election and he has certain things he wants to achieve.
But also give credit to the sheer stamina of the guy.
Yeah.
You consider that, he finishes rallies 11 o'clock
gets on a plane.
At night. Okay, he gets on a plane. 5:30, he's hitting the tarmac in another city. And he did this consistently. I mean,
Dana White says when he gave his acceptance speech, because Dana White apparently was with him that last 2 days, Dana White says that he had not slept for 48 hours.
Exactly, and I believe that.
And the guy's an 80-year-old man, and
well, yeah, pushing 80, yeah.
Yeah, close. His stamina is quite something, and he really did put a lot of effort into winning this election. But I just think there was a sudden change, and let's talk about the shift on the 2020 election. I've never felt that election was free and fair. Right now, as I said at the time, unfortunately, elections are contemporaneous. So if you ask someone who won the 2001 or 2000 or whatever it was election in Zimbabwe, they will tell you that Robert Mugabe won that election. Okay. Now, the fact that there was huge shenanigans that went on with that election, and he may very well not have in fact won that election, is irrelevant. Because once an election has been called, the way that we just function is we can be disgruntled and we can say it wasn't fair and all the rest of it is, but that person ends up becoming the leader. That's just how it works. And so, unfortunately, once Fox called Arizona on that night for Biden, it was over. And so that's a separate argument in terms of how everything then unfolded. I always felt that Trump had no chance of reversing the result because elections are contemporaneous. That said, there were clearly things that went, they were nuts. I mean, someone has asked, one of our viewers has asked about the millions of votes.
We need to come back to that point that you just made, that Trump had no chance of reversing it, because that's actually.
I know you will feel that he had a chance. I just think in the overall scheme of things he didn't. But we can come back to it. What I want to point out is that for years, firstly, you were banned from social media if you said that election wasn't free and fair. Let's start there. Then, if you were able to somehow intimate that the election wasn't quite free and fair, even on X in the last year, you were a kook if you thought that election wasn't. Trump was constantly criticized for not still saying that the election wasn't free and fair, and that feeling that it was stolen from him. And in fact, I watched this happen on the day of this last election. Now, accounts that for years had denied that there could have been anything wrong with that election, suddenly noticing, hold on a second, there is a discrepancy in Democrat votes in this election of about 9 to 10 million. And where did they go? So Joe Biden remains, by the way, according to popular vote, the most voted for president in the history of the United States. Okay. Kamala is, I think, somewhere in the region of 11 million votes short of Joe Biden. Trump roughly gets the same amount of votes in 16, 20, and 24. A little bit more, but not millions. And somehow between 2020 and 2024, there's 9 to 10 million votes missing. And they're all Democrat votes. None of them are Republican votes. And it just doesn't make sense, right? And so suddenly people start seeing this.
Well, when California is still counting, and you'll suddenly discover that there are millions of votes that accrue there. Yeah. But so moving back to the present, you're familiar with the Brunson election case?
Tell us.
Okay. So essentially there was a person who out of his own pocket went all the way to the Supreme Court by saying that based on the fact that the Supreme Court did not consider the fact that the election might have been, significant officials did not allow for an investigation of the fact that the elections had been stolen. Those people have actually committed a treasonous act. And this is a case that was tossed up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court declined to hear it at the time. Okay, but the fact of the matter is that there is still the possibility that the Supreme Court will be able to revisit it.
The 2020 election?
Yes. Based on the fact, because remember that this is not challenging the results of the election. It is challenging the integrity of the people who went ahead and certified the election. And that goes all the way through to Mike Pence.
Yeah.
Because they failed in their duty to investigate. It's not that they failed to overturn the results. They failed in their duty to investigate, which was always Trump's case.
Yes.
He said it is the law actually requires that you guys go out and investigate these claims before you're able to pronounce on the results. And they didn't do that.
I hear you. And so, look, maybe that results in something. I think the Supreme Court will likely sidestep that, if I had to guess, because I think they will feel that it's better.
No, I don't think so. I think that what's very likely is now that the election is out of the way, this is a point at which the Supreme Court can actually establish it as a point of law in order to prevent a recurrence of this in further elections.
Perhaps, yes. And I would hope that they will do that. But I will note that the Supreme Court very much vies away, and has previously vied away from anything related as far as is possible to the elections, because they want to be seen as being separate.
Yeah,
from that.
Hence my saying this is the reason why they have not considered it up until now. But with the elections completely out of the way, can they establish ground rules that, to my mind, should really be necessary? I think the other things that are going to come before the court, which they will pronounce upon within this next term that Trump is serving, is the question of voter ID. I'm pretty clear that certainly the Supreme Court does have the jurisdiction in terms of federal elections to require that
Voter ID.
the integrity of the elections be protected. And the fundamental level of doing that is by actually having voter ID. And so, again, it's the type of case where if it had been brought before the elections, then the Democrats would have claimed that this is basically a rigged case based on the fact that this is, quote, a Trump Supreme Court, unquote.
Cool. So, yeah, let's see if that happens. There was a question from Ben around those discrepancy in those votes, and I can't explain it, Ben. That's the reality. The only way, look, I've always felt that there was a lot of shenanigans that went on in the 2020 elections. I think you can see some of those shenanigans in 2024. As Kanthan was saying, not only did you have people like Musk and Pressler on the ground in places like Pennsylvania, but Ronna McDaniel was removed as the chair of the RNC about a year before the election. Much against her protestation. They'd been trying to remove her for several years. She did terribly in the 2020 elections. Then the Republicans did poorly in the midterms, much more poorly compared to how they were meant to do. There was supposed to be a so-called red wave that never happened. And she...
Well, I think, to be fair, a lot of the red wave failed because of Roe versus Wade. And I think that there was a great deal of rallying that took place at the time.
Yeah, there was.
Around Roe
the
versus
thing is,
Wade.
elections are always two sides to an argument, right? And you've got to make your argument. And Ronna McDaniel was seemingly standing in the way of making the argument for some reason.
So what I'm saying is that both things are simultaneously true.
Yeah.
That, so the lack of a red wave, I'm saying, is not her fault. But was she fundamentally incompetent? The answer to that is yes.
Incompetent or malicious. And I know people love to use Occam's razor, but I think that sometimes people are malicious and people do want certain things, and so you have to assume that they're going to try to get them. But point being is that Trump then appoints two different people. One is Laura Trump to the RNC, and I forget the gentleman's name with a W, but he... Whittles, I think, if I'm not mistaken. But they then go about trying to secure the elections, knowing that there are going to be these attempts at these shenanigans. So they deployed more than, I think the number was somewhere around 260,000 election poll watchers, those types of people, and also apparently over 500 lawyers in every sort of swing state. And in fact, on the morning of the election, you had some shenanigans going on in Pennsylvania. And lawyers arrived at the site 45 minutes later and said, sorry, what's happening here?
Yes, because Republican observers were denied access to the counting.
And the Republican lawyers arrived and said, is there a problem here? Would you like to go to court? And the polling station said, no, there won't be a problem. We will admit your observers. So there was a lot of good stuff that happened, and you can only hope that that will continue. I know someone like Vivek Ramaswamy has said that one of his pet issues is that he would like America to vote on a single day, which is a holiday, with paper ballots that are counted on the same day, which he says correctly that many other countries manage to do, including this one.
Which, interestingly, Germany is not able to do right now, but we'll talk about that next week.
Yes.
You're priming it. No, the reason for that segue is that the German government has collapsed, but they say they can't hold elections immediately because they don't have the capacity to print ballot papers.
Germany, basically the world's leading engineering economy.
Yeah. So let's now step back. I think we could touch on some of the appointments that Trump has announced.
So there are some questions around that.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we can drill down into.
Do you have more to say, or do you want to get straight into some of these questions, which I think will direct the conversation?
Yeah, I think we should maybe run through some of the appointees that that Trump has actually confirmed so far.
All right. So I think let's just go straight to it. So we've got Safa says, I'd like you to discuss why people like Pompeo may be joining the new Trump administration and what should Trump do in his first 100 days. Just hold that thought. Ramon, who we know well, said asked about the importance of keeping neocons out of the administration. So that's both are kind of similar questions in many ways. And then I think there might have been one other with regards to this. But let's talk appointments quickly. I'll see if I can find the other ones. But it's already been stated that Trump. So the Pompeo thing seems to have been a purposeful leak, which embarrassed Ben Shapiro a little bit, because Ben Shapiro comes out and goes, "Yeah, Pompeo is being considered for some sort of secretary post."
So I think what actually happened out there is that Trump has been deliberately tossing out stuff to see who ends up leaking it. And I think he's been very selective in terms of information that he's fed to particular sources. And, part of it is to get a sense of who he can trust and who he cannot trust. And I think that's, again, straight out of the art of war, and I think it's a good thing to do.
Yeah.
So, but talking very specifically about the appointments that he's got so far. So, firstly, let's look in terms of the neocons. Okay, so we've now got...
Let's define a neocon.
So, this is going to be an interesting one, because we have war hawks, okay, who are people who are very bullish on the U.S. going off and doing forever wars and all of that kind of stuff. And then there are the neocons, who are people who are funded by the military-industrial complex. So you will see that on their list of donors, there are the likes of Raytheon, and there's Boeing, and so forth, who fund these guys on a regular basis. And they then have every inclination to maintain the status quo, irrespective of which party happens to be in charge. And that pretty much is the neocon orbit. So one can say to a large extent that, so Bolton was very much one of those. John Bolton.
Joe Bolton's never seen a land that isn't America he wouldn't like to bomb.
Exactly. And so Pompeo was in that mold as well. And Nikki Haley, to some extent, is also in the same mold. Now, on the other hand, you have someone like Marco Rubio, who is now tipped for Secretary of State. For the rest of us in the world, that's the Minister of Foreign Affairs, but they call it Secretary of State in the U.S. And Marco Rubio is an interesting one, because he's very much a war hawk.
Yeah.
So he's very bullish on taking military action as a sign of asserting America's dominance in many parts of the world. At the same time, he's also very firmly on the side of Israel, and has been absolutely clear in many viral clips that have done the round, that as far as he's concerned, the priority is the extermination of Hamas, and no further discussions will be entertained around the question of Israel until such time as Hamas is actually taken out. So I think that's an interesting first appointment, simply because of the fact that it's pulling the entire Middle East now front and center into where Trump's priorities are going to be in the short space of time. The work that he started in terms of the Abraham Accords was derailed basically by what happened on October 7th last year. And he's now at the stage where he needs to actually get back onto that and to actually fix it once and for all. Now, unfortunately, the Biden administration so severely screwed up the entire Middle East process at a number of levels. The first thing that Biden did was that he had declared MBS, the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia, to be an enemy, and that he was going to go after him. What happened immediately as a result? There was a pivot on the part of Saudi Arabia across to the rest of the world. So Saudi Arabia then ended up forging extremely strong ties with Russia, extremely strong ties with China, and then China ends up brokering a peace accord between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And you can understand from Saudi Arabia's point of view that they do not want to get drawn into a Hamas-sponsored war.
Well, I think what needs to also be said there is that the two biggest forces in the Middle East are Saudi Arabia and Iran, and that they are basically pitched against each other for cultural reasons, actually, and that Biden not only shunned Saudi Arabia and pushed them into the arms of the Chinese and the Russians, but he also basically let the shackles off Iran that Trump had them in. And so that then went from a power dynamic where Saudi were on the ascendancy in the Middle East as the dominant power in the Middle East, and Iran were very much subdued under the first Trump administration, to making Iran ascendant and attempting to take away from Saudi Arabia. But what you've ended up with is now two powers at this stage that are somewhat equal in some respects and are then basically warring with each other. This is behind the scenes. They're not openly, but the stuff that goes on in Yemen, the Houthi stuff, some of the stuff to do with Israel, some of the stuff going on in Syria, a lot of this stuff is satellites of each sort of.
But again, let's talk about the Houthi stuff, as a very good example, because a lot of people have been talking about the so-called Trump effect, where immediately after his elections, there's a range of things that have been immediately happening around the world. And one of the things, so Qatar has confirmed that it's asked Hamas to leave. So remember that the...
Didn't ask them to leave after October 7th.
No, but immediately at the point at which Trump gets elected, they make it very clear that Hamas is no longer welcome on their territory.
Yep.
So then the Houthis also announce a de-escalation on their part. And all of this ties into the fact that, and this is something that you and I spoke about in the early days of this podcast, where I was very clear that October 7th would never have happened under Trump. Mm-hmm. But more to the point, had it happened under Trump, there would have been an immediate response on the part of the Americans. The Americans would have had boots on the ground in Gaza, and they would have gone house to house, and there would have been decisive action to immediately put a stop to it.
Yeah, I'm not sure I agree with that,
but I'm very clear that has always been the case from Trump's point of view. So right now, what I'm seeing in terms of his appointment, so he's got Pete Hegseth as Secretary of Defense.
Oh, that's a new appointment in the last 12 hours, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, again, the Western mainstream media has been saying, okay, they've appointed a Fox News commentator as Secretary of Defense.
Yeah.
Okay. This guy,
he was part of the National Guard, wasn't he?
Well, he's a graduate of my alma mater. Okay,
of course. There we go. Got to drop it in.
Okay, Army combat veteran. I didn't mention the name of the Ivy League university concerned. John, work with me here. Okay, he did tours in Guantanamo Bay and in Iraq and Afghanistan. Decorated with 2 Bronze Stars. Combat infantryman's badge.
He's a major, and he's still enrolled, so he hasn't retired or
exactly.
So he's a major in the military, who will become the Secretary.
And
of
more
Defense.
to the point, he wrote a book called The War on Warriors, which spent 9 weeks on the New York Times bestsellers list, including 2 weeks at number 1. Mm-hmm. Okay, and which was talking about just the destruction of the American military that has happened to a large extent under Joe Biden, who insisted on bringing DEI into the military, where you suddenly had these transgender generals dictating what goes on.
I think something that needs to be remembered is that Mark Milley, who is chairman of the Joint Chiefs, basically the leading general, who reports to the president, committed treason. Okay.
Explain.
So, in Trump's last term, towards the end of the term, Milley met with the Chinese, not with the permission of Trump. He met with the Chinese and told the Chinese He gave the Chinese assurances on what the American military would and wouldn't do based on what he was willing to do. In other words, ignoring Trump, and told them essentially, don't worry about Trump, I'm in charge.
Okay, so I need to drill down on this particular point, and I'll tell you why it's not treason. Okay, and the particular piece of legislation that people have been hanging this on is called the Logan Act.
Yeah, well, that's not the legislation. I'm not hanging it on the Logan Act. But you can explain the Logan Act.
No, but
the Logan Act is a lobbyist for another country.
No.
You're not disclosed.
No. That's not the point about the Logan Act. The Logan Act makes it treasonous for any person who is not in the U.S. government to negotiate with a hostile power in times of war. And the reason why I'm saying with a hostile power in times of war...
It's not that. I've just Googled it. So don't say something you don't want to be caught on camera saying.
No.
The Logan Act is a federal law that prohibits unauthorized private diplomacy with foreign nations. In other words, you have to register as a foreign...
Yes, but under what circumstances is the question?
Under any circumstances.
No. It's not under any circumstances.
I promise.
Because you see, the definition of diplomacy with a foreign nation has been very specifically circumscribed in terms of...
I'll read you another part that'll give you more, but I don't want to get too deep into the Logan Act because I don't think it's about the Logan Act.
No, the reason why the Logan Act is significant, and I have to come back to this.
It's with the intent to influence the measures or conduct of a foreign government or to defeat the measures of the United States. It's basically to just act against your country. So it's not in a time of war.
I want to come back to the Logan Act. And here's the reason why this is absolutely critical.
Yeah.
Okay, so one of the things that you would have seen in most of...
what are you furiously Googling?
No, something that you would have...
You're acting like Jamie on the Rogan podcast, like bringing shit up.
So you might have seen that over the past 48 hours...
Yeah.
There was the story that was leaked by the Washington Post that Trump had a conversation with Putin.
Yeah, he probably did, though.
So now there are two things that we need to point out, okay? And I've already made this a point whenever people have asked me about it. Trump is the type of person where when he does have these types of conversations, he's very upfront about it, and he speaks about it in public. More to the point, the Kremlin has denied that there was any contact. That took place. But the reason why I brought this up is because immediately at the point at which the story came out, immediately the Democrat trolls began coming out and saying, this is in violation of the Logan Act, and Trump must now be tried for treason.
But I think you're splitting two different issues.
No. So the reason why I'm saying that this is important, okay? The Logan Act implies very specifically in cases where people mediate in disputes involving the United States and a foreign power.
But it's not, Kanthan. I've just read it to you. It's not just for disputes.
The Logan Act, enacted January 30th, 1799, is a United States federal law that criminalizes the negotiation of a dispute between the United States and a foreign government by an unauthorized American citizen. The intent behind the act is to prevent unauthorized negotiations from undermining the government's position. The act was passed following George Logan's unauthorized negotiations with France in 1796 and was signed into law by President John Adams on January 30th. Act was amended in 1994, changing the penalty for violation from fined $5,000 to fined under this title, which was the only amendment of it's a felony, punishable, and only two people.
Okay, but you aren't refuting my point because the Federalist Society, who is pretty much the Republican Society, which basically tells the president which Republican judge to nominate to the Supreme Court. These are very powerful people who know a lot about the law. And in fact, all the sitting judges are part of that society, okay? The Republicans at least, or the ones who fall on the Republican side, themselves say it's an old but rarely invoked federal statute prohibiting unauthorized private diplomacy with foreign nations. Diplomacy is not in and of itself just about disputes. Diplomacy can be about anything. Okay, and so that's why they've tried to invoke it. But I don't know why we've gone down this Logan Act hole, which is going to terribly bore our audience.
Because you started talking about the fact
because
that you said he committed treason.
Yes, because U.S. military law considers when a general negotiates with another nation against that nation, against the orders of the commander-in-chief, that would be considered treason. It's got nothing to do with the Logan Act. I acknowledge that if you brought the Logan Act into play on this, I acknowledge that it would fall absolutely flat. I could care less. I think everyone can fundamentally, and this is the point, this is actually the point, in fact, of Trump's whole election.
I hear what you're saying.
There's a narrative and there's a reality.
I hear what you're saying. But I'm saying that defining it as treasonous would actually require that there was actually a breach in terms of the protocols.
And let me explain to you how this would work. Let me explain to you how this works. Trump comes into power. If he decides to do this, Trump comes into power. Mark Milley gets court-martialed. It's got nothing to do with the Logan Act because Logan Act is civilian law.
Yes.
Okay? He gets court-martialed. This is now military law, right? There's a military tribunal in which they go and say, right, General Milley, did you or did you not tell the Chinese that they had nothing to be worried about in terms of the United States and that you would decide military action and how it proceeded and would ignore the command of your commander-in-chief? Did you or did you not? If they can prove that he did in fact do that in a military court, that is going to be called treason, which is punishable by death.
By a firing squad, yes.
Yes. Okay.
That will be an okay.
Let's move on.
I take your point.
Let's move on from Milley.
You do understand. Understand that people have now been bringing up the Logan Act, and it was important for me to clarify that because I'm saying that there are two narratives at play, okay? And now this kind of goes back in terms of what's going to happen over the next 3 months.
Yes.
Okay, and there are two millstones that are currently hanging over the Trump administration.
Yeah.
Okay, the one is the Middle East, and the other is Ukraine. And
I wanted to talk about Ukraine.
Okay, but no, hang on a second.
Yeah.
To some extent, people would bring Taiwan into it as well, but I'm just leaving that off the table for now.
Mm-hmm.
But what's very clear over the past 48 hours, starting with this leak of the story from the Washington Post, which says that Trump had a conversation with Putin where he was effectively following the Biden line, which is, you need to be showing restraint and pulling back.
Yeah.
And it's very clear to me that this is now an attempt by those self-same neocons to try and shift the conversation to say that actually, Trump agrees with the approach that has been taken up until now, and to try and build expectations ahead of Trump's actual inauguration. Now, to a large extent, Trump has been probably the worst thing that he's got to deal with right now is Ukraine. And the reason why it's the worst thing is that there is no way that the U.S. can win that one. Just very simply.
It depends how you define victory, but sure. If you're defining victory as Russia being defeated,
yes,
absolutely agree with you.
So there's also no way that the Russians are going to give back the 4 territories that have since annexed. Mm-hmm. There's no way. Right now, what has Trump got left to bargain with? He can't threaten military action. Well, the simple reason why he cannot threaten military action is because there is no agreement between Ukraine and the United States that would require the United States to intercede on the part of Ukraine, because they're not part of NATO. Entirely different thing if Russia was going after a NATO state. Now, Trump is therefore put in a situation where the only thing that he can really do out there is to actually walk away, just drop all support and say this is now going to be something for the Europeans to sort out. It is, literally their problem. They must keep the money flowing. We've done everything that we've can. I've already promised the American people that I'm not going to be spending money on forever wars. I'm going to be spending money on actually bringing it back home and sorting out all of these very real problems that we have. Meanwhile, the lobby in support of continuing the forever wars, and that's exactly all of the neocons who are still sitting in the U.S. government, is to try and shift the conversation back to Trump continuing to offer support for the Ukrainians going forward. And it's a poison chalice.
Okay, so let me give my answer, because that I feel like, is that your answer on like Trump's appointments and the neocons?
No, that's my. Well, Trump's appointments are very specifically, to my mind,
Yeah.
with the view to sorting out the Middle East once and for all. And I'm very clear that.
Okay, so I don't think his appointments are solely that, because remember, he's made a few appointments.
Yes.
Okay, let me talk quickly to the neocon argument. So I think, you know, the Kanthan gave a nice sort of delineation there between a war hawk and a neocon. I think all Americans are on some level war hawks, in my opinion, okay? Because I don't think you will find any sort of military-focused American who doesn't feel that if the right circumstances apprise themselves, they wouldn't go to war. So, for example, if you bomb an American embassy somewhere, you're going to die. Okay, and even the most dovish kind of person, maybe not Chomsky, but pretty much everyone else sort of to the right of Chomsky, which is almost everyone on earth, will be like, yeah, that's it, you're going down, right? So Warhawk is different to neocon. I feel like neocon for me is about the military-industrial complex. Neocon is about this idea which sort of started in the 90s and really was pushed out with the Bush administration, about spreading democracy. And how do you spread democracy? Well, through the barrel of an M16, okay? Through a Tomahawk missile. That's how you spread democracy, okay? And in doing that, what you do is you colonize. It's a new colonization age, and you colonize these places. And so you have to put troops there, because otherwise the people don't want to just convert into your political culture. And so you've got to put troops there to kind of force it over. And doing that, of course, is very lucrative, because it creates an industry that just constantly feeds back into America. And it gives people things to talk about, to be elected on. It gives them ways to get them to build military production lines in certain states. So if you're a governor like Nikki Haley, that's a good thing. That's what the neocon is trying to do. They're not necessarily just going to war, but they're going to war for everything that results following being at war constantly. And that is what the forever wars are really about. And in fact...
Which is pretty much echoing what I said in terms of them being funded by the military-industrial complex,
sure.
including... Yeah.
Sure. So that's that side. Cool. And look, there's some criticism for Trump here. He's made some appointments. Rubio is going to be Secretary of State. And Rubio is seen to be quite hardline in terms of America is sort of this power, and we're going to exert the power. But I think you need to take it into context. Rubio has been something about Trump's appointments. Everyone he's appointed has been a supporter of his since at least 2016. So I would have thought, I'm not a big fan of Tulsi, but she's in the mix. And so you've got to put her somewhere. And he's going to put her somewhere. And I thought, well, SecDef might not be a bad place to put her, because she's not a warhawk, or she's not a neocon at least. And so she will defend America, but she's not very attacking minded, and she doesn't feel that they should be going to war. So I don't think that would be a bad person in that position. But who's he appointed? He's appointed Pete Hegseth. Now, Pete Hegseth has been a supporter of his since 2016. It's a long time to stand by Donald Trump, especially given what the summary I gave earlier is, right? It was unpopular to support him in 15. It was fine because he had Joe and Mika on MSNBC supporting him until they saw he might have a chance of winning. But from 16, it's been unpopular. After January 6th, it was just, you cannot possibly support Trump. He's put people in who have supported him since the beginning. You look at Homan, who's been made the border czar. I mean, firstly, that oak is hard as nails. Let's just go there. A great appointment. But a guy who has supported Donald Trump from the beginning. You go look at Stephen Miller. Stephen Miller is Deputy Chief of Staff, and he also supported Trump vociferously throughout. He's going to be head of policy, essentially. So he's going to be doing internal sort of policy. Wiles. He's known Wiles since 16 as well. Also been supportive of him throughout, has run this campaign of his, seems to really be able to wrangle him quite well, which is a good person to have as chief of staff, because the reason he had a disciplined campaign And I said it on another podcast, a very disciplined campaign. So look, you're going to get some people who you look and you go, these are, let's not call them neocons, they're establishment.
So let's talk about the optics around this stuff. And, I think that's significant in terms of the Hegseth appointment. People have been asking, why Hegseth? Why not Tulsi Gabbard? So my take on this very clearly is that right now, in terms of doing a reset, in terms of turning the U.S. military into the great force that it used to be, just 40 years ago, you want to have a hard alpha male in charge of it, very specifically. Okay, and if Trump is wanting to send out a message to the rest of the world, this is not going to be a space to put in political correctness by appointing a woman. Don't get me wrong, Gabbard is incredibly competent.
You're a fan. You like her.
I'm a fan. She's incredibly competent. But in this particular case, he wants to turn the military around. The military has been emasculated. And turning the military around so that it actually becomes a fighting force that the Americans can actually look up to. When you have a hard bastard in charge, people will show respect to that establishment. It's not a question. You see, the American military is not supposed to be nice.
That's correct.
No military is meant to be nice.
That's right.
Okay, the military is meant to
Which is, as I pointed out before, it's the reason why they have their own law.
Yes.
The civilian law doesn't cover stuff in the military. You can do stuff in civilian life that you cannot do in the military.
Absolutely right. And so, I think a lot of what Trump is doing right now is doing a reset in terms of the optics. And what comes to mind was something that Trump said with regard to Bolton, where, and he said this fairly recently on one of the long-form interviews that he was doing, where he said that, Bolton was crazy, but when I was negotiating, he was a great guy to have in the room because people would look at Bolton and they say, this guy is batshit crazy.
He's going to bomb us.
Yeah, okay, he's going to bomb us. So let's take this conversation seriously.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the appointments that Trump is doing right now is also taking that into account. Remember right now, in terms of the global stage, you take a look at Lavrov, highly competent. As foreign secretary. You look at Jaishankar in India, highly competent.
Jaishankar in India is unbelievable.
Yeah.
Do yourself a favor. Go Google, go YouTube some clips of the foreign secretary in India, Jaishankar. Hey,
yes.
That's how I say it. Honestly, a very talented politician. He's unbelievable. And let me tell you, if you think Modi is something, which he is, but if you think Modi is something, if Jaishankar ends up as the Prime Minister of India at some point, which he is a shoe-in to be, wow, he's Indian Trump pretty much.
Yeah, and so you've got Lavrov, and then you've got Jaishankar, and in China you've got Wang Yi. Now, all three of these guys,
you know, Kanthan, I just have to say you are very impressive because I could have said Lavrov and Jaishankar, but I could not have said you are very impressive in terms of your knowledge.
Look, the fact is that these guys are towering figures on the global stage. Okay, they just from an intellectual point of view, but they have presence, all of them. Lavrov walks into a room, people take him seriously. Okay, no matter what you think of the Russians, the guy has all of his facts at his fingertips. And more importantly, he brings that sense of presence. And I think, again, what Trump is trying to do is to bring that sense of presence in terms of when he walks into the room. Trump has this thing that he will not stand on ceremony. He will push his way front and center and take up the biggest space in the room because that is his style. And the team that he's going to take into these negotiations with Russia, with India, with China, is going to be people who have that type of physical presence in the room. I'm clear about that.
I just want to get back to Ramon's point about the importance of keeping neocons out. I think he's going to keep neocons out to a point. But I think some people will say Rubio is a neocon. okay, from their perspective. I think what needs to be understood, and what I've enjoyed about a lot of these appointments so far is that you can see both sides freaking out. And I mean both sides of Trump's supporters. So the hardcore sort of Israel haters, on the sort of what I suppose could be called the far right, whatever you want to call it. I don't want to demonize them necessarily, but the people who hate Israel and, don't want any involvement there and let Israel not even be an ally type of people. And then obviously you got the other side who are very sort of pro-Israel. And what I've loved about it is how pissed off both sides have been with some of the appointments, right? And I think what needs to be remembered is Trump is still who Trump is. If you think on Israel, for example, if you think the first American president ever to say he was going to move the embassy and actually move the embassy, the first president to actually be so openly supportive of Israel and so radically unsupportive of Hamas and the Palestinian Authority is suddenly going to change his mind and be like, yeah, you're right, guys, screw Israel. It's not going to happen. Okay, you still need to take Trump for who Trump is. One of the things I was disappointed with on the Rogan podcast is Trump's conflation, which is something that people of his age would do because of the media narrative, but his conflation between nuclear energy and nuclear war. Okay, and so he still feels that nuclear energy is some sort of danger like a nuclear weapon. And he hasn't yet reformulated, and he might never.
Well, but
so there are going to be pros and cons.
Again, in his defense, okay, and I'll say that the reason why that's front and center is very specifically the case of Iran. Because remember that Iran's quest for nuclear power has always at the same time carried the caveat that there's the propensity to do enrichment, which can then potentially lead to a nuclear weapon. And given his particular focus on Iran, I can see how those issues always come together.
But again, Trump is going to be who Trump's going to be. So is he going to keep all the inverted commas neocons out? No, I don't think he's going to. I would refer to Marco Rubio more as establishment. He's an establishment kind of guy. But remember, he's got to get through a Senate. He's got to get through a Senate. So he can appoint a certain number of people who are like a little bit left of field, right of field, whatever it is. And he's got to appoint a certain number of people who are relatively down the line so that he can get this all done and appointed. At the end of the day, Trump is still going to be who Trump is going to be. Let me tell you, if Rubio oversteps the line and suddenly wants to start attacking countries, and we know Trump doesn't like war. We know he doesn't like going to war. We know he doesn't like launching missiles. We know he's not that guy. He didn't do it in his first term. There was one instance everyone points to, which is Syria. There was one instance, none other. It's so obvious. I can point to two. There was the Moab, which was hilarious because that was ISIS in the mountains, which was funny. But and then the Syrian thing, he just doesn't like that. So the truth is if Rubio oversteps the mark, Rubio's going to get fired. Okay, that's going to happen. So I think you need to take it into context in terms of appointments. In terms of what he's done so far, his appointments of the guy for the border, his appointments of Stephen Miller, his appointments, I think his chief of staff is a good appointment in my opinion, but wait to be seen.
She does look like an Afrikaans tanny, though.
Yes, no, she looks like she'll beat you like with the board duster. But Hegseth seems to be a good appointment, mainly because he's openly stood up and said the military cannot be woke. This is not a concern of the military. The military needs to be the meanest, toughest people we can find to fight wars. That's as simple as it is. That's who the military is. The rest of the stuff is irrelevant to the military. You want that stuff, go somewhere else. So I think those appointments have been good. I think it's going to end up being a mixed bag for everyone. No one's going to be happy with everything. Let me just tell you. And obviously we all have these sort of fantasies in our head. But again, I go back to Trump is picking people who he knows have been on the inside with him for 10 years. And who haven't left his side for 10 years. And the media used to give him such trouble about how he wants people who are loyal to him. Trump's all about loyalty. And as if that's a bad thing. To be frank, one of the best things you can value about any relationship in life is loyalty. If you don't have loyalty, you have almost nothing else. If your friends won't stand up for you, then how are they your friends? So I think on the appointment side, that's what's happening from my perspective. I'm quite happy with his appointments. I don't think all of them are perfect. I wouldn't have appointed Rubio as an example, but I get where he's coming from.
Who would you have appointed is the question. And, and I always come back to that. And remember that, again, we're talking in the context of being able to stand in the same room as Lavrov and Jaishankar and Wang Yi, and being able to hold your own at a number of levels. And I think Rubio actually ticks those boxes.
Okay, so he would never make this appointment because of all the water under the bridge, but Ron DeSantis would be the right person to be Secretary of State. And he's proven it. When there were Americans who were trapped in Afghanistan, he organized private jets because the Biden administration refused to evacuate those people after the military had withdrawn. He helped Americans get home after October 7th. He's already done many Secretary of State things.
He needs Ron DeSantis in Florida.
Ron DeSantis could leave. Ron DeSantis is governor for 2 more years, I think.
Yes.
And then he's out anyway. So the reality is Ron DeSantis could leave, and there's no way anyone who Ron DeSantis nominated as his heir apparent wouldn't become the governor in and of themselves. And I think that would have been the best move for Secretary of State. I understand why Trump hasn't done it, and it's on loyalty again. It's on loyalty. And Ron DeSantis will have his place in American politics. Everyone who's a big stand for Ron DeSantis, don't worry, he's not going anywhere. He's an effective guy. I don't know if he'll ever end up as POTUS because he just doesn't have the charisma, in my opinion. But I cannot see him not being involved in American politics for a very long time. And remember, it remains to be seen with regards to the Senate in Florida, what happens. So DeSantis may end up in the Senate ultimately. He may end up in another cabinet position in time, or he will run for president in 2028 and may end up it might be Vance DeSantis, for example, as a ticket. That's entirely possible. It might be DeSantis someone else. It depends. So that's probably who I would have put in. But I understand why he's put in Rubio. I get it. Let's get to a couple more things. That was quite a long, and I knew this was going to be a long podcast. I think Justin sent us a meme. The meme is a tortoise.
The post turtle, yes.
The tortoise or the turtle on a post.
The post turtle is.
And then it says she didn't get there by herself. She doesn't belong there. She doesn't know what to do there. She was elevated beyond her ability to function. So who's the dumbass that put her there? And he wants us to kind of talk about that. Obviously, Kamala is done and dusted now. I don't think we will hear much from her again.
I think a point that we should touch on very briefly is where to now for the Democrats.
Okay, so let's talk quickly about Kamala, and then we'll talk on where to for the Democrats.
Yeah, look, I think let's just write off Kamala. I think we've wasted enough time on her.
Okay, but she was incompetent to be there.
Yes,
we agree on that.
And she had absolutely no right. And the woman could not string a sentence together.
Yeah,
she only indulged in word salad. She could not go into an unscripted interview. And can you imagine her sitting across the table from Putin and saying, "I'm speaking." It's not going to work. And then I come from a middle-class family.
And just terrible. Terrible.
Yeah,
terrible.
What an absolute disaster. And the idea that the American people would be dumb enough to actually believe that this was a person that was capable of actually leading the United States was absolutely nuts. But I think that the Democratic Party right now, there's no obvious front-runner in terms of how that party is able to reset itself. And
the problem you have is that there's actually two sides to that party now, and they're very well delineated. And so what has happened is pre this election, that was the party of left-wing identity politics. That was the party of transgender monkeys, chimpanzees or whatever they were experimenting on. That was the party of LGBTQI++++. That was the party of identity politics, Black Lives Matter, etc., etc., etc. That was the party of shout your abortion. That was the party of Hamas, frankly. That was what they were up to this election.
But you must understand at the same time, the reason why they were that is because you did not have any leader of stature who was actually front and center and able to point out the obvious idiocy of that. Because Biden and Harris have been pretty much working off script.
Yes.
And, one could argue that, certainly in the latter part of his tenure, Obama was pretty much doing the same thing.
Without a doubt. No,
Yeah, he was laying the groundwork.
Black Lives Matter happens 100% as a result of Obama.
Yes. So, but the important thing is that none of those are able to now stake a claim to where the party. So the question is, who is going to lead it?
So this is the point. Is that was the party before the election. Now that is still some of the party, because those left-wing elements are not letting go. They still want that to be the party. Then you have people like Gavin Newsom, people like who will bend the knee to some of it.
No, but Newsom's very much part. No, he's very much part of that.
He knows when to say no, so he refused to sign one of the transgender bills, for example, that came across his desk. Right, so he's smart. He knows when to push it and when not to push it. And that may be the middle road the Democrats need, because you've got someone like Josh Shapiro, who's very much middle of the road. He needs to be, because he's in Pennsylvania, but he's a middle of the road kind of guy. And he's an old school Democrat. So he's a 2011, 12 Obama-ite, right? That's how he speaks. That's how he sounds. That's sort of how he legislates or how he governs. And so they're going to have to decide between, do we want to be Democrats of the early 2000s, late 90s, Bill Clinton, early 2000s, or do we want to be this left-wing party? Now, those are the two things they're fighting. What might be interesting, I think, is what comes, which is that AOC is a middle on both of those. So AOC is populist. Okay, and so what will happen, I think, is, and she's basically the new Bernie Sanders. So what you have is, you may get a Josh Shapiro come out and be the adults in the room type of thing. We're going to be the normal Democrats. We're not going to be crazy and try to trance your kids. You may get the Gavin Newsom trying to split the baby, or I think you'll probably get an AOC or an AOC-like character who's populists, appeals to the average voter who feels she's, inverted commas, real. That's a big comment she gets from voters a lot of the time. Bearing in mind, she won her election, but that same district went for Trump.
Yes.
Okay, so very interesting, right? So they like her. That was an example of splitting, which I said didn't happen a lot in this election, but there it did. So you've got her, and she may carry a populist message, which resembles a little bit what you've seen from Trump, but obviously carries a lot of the left-wing stuff with it.
Yeah, and to your point that, she's taking a lot of the messaging that made Bernie Sanders successful, which was stomped down at the time by the established Democrats. So, yeah, I think you're quite right about Shapiro. I can't see Newsom being able to claim that ground, because what is really going to define the way forward is that the entire world is able to see what an absolute disaster California is. At every measurable level.
Yeah.
And for this man to then want to step up onto the global stage and say that I'm here to represent the United States, I cannot see the Americans actually going for it. I agree completely in terms of your view around AOC, and I think that there's certainly going to be a build-up of support around her over the next period. Shapiro, yes, I completely agree as well.
And others will emerge.
Yeah. So, well, as I said, way before these elections, I thought Dean Phillips was impressive. I thought Marianne Williamson was impressive. And obviously before they jumped ship, both RFK and
Tulsi.
And Tulsi were people that the country could have actually rallied around. So, but I think that the Democrats are going to be licking their wounds. There's going to be a lot of jostling for what's left of power behind the stage. There's going to be lots of...
Someone asked, do you think they'll learn their lesson? I mean, do you think they'll learn their lesson?
So I think a lot of them have learned a lesson, but the question is whether the people who have actually learned the lessons are the people who get to call the shots in terms of the DNC. And I think until control of the DNC is actually open to a more democratic process, you're not going to see that happening. So I think we've got about 10 minutes left before
So what I want to do,
wrap up.
because we've gone through some of this stuff, but I think let's try you and I do something we're not very good at, which is try to be brief. So I'll kind of say what the sort of query or comment has been, and then try to say it in a sentence, or I'll try to say it in a sentence. Shall we try that?
Just okay.
Okay, so Anthony had a whole bunch of questions. Trump's new cabinet versus old. I think we've largely discussed that.
All right.
New campaign strategy through to podcast. I think we've discussed that. I mean, put it this way. Any future potential POTUS wannabe who doesn't go on long-form podcasts doesn't have a campaign. That's going to be the new strategy. The power of X we've discussed. Can Trump actually go through his promises, and will they be positive so that even the haters can't deny?
I think that if he fixes the border as an immediate thing and deports all of the criminals, not everyone, but if he deports all of the criminals, that there'll be immediate cheering from all sides.
And energy will be the other big thing, I think, because he'll lower the price of things through that.
I think energy is going to be a relatively quick win.
Absolutely.
And I think you'll see that happening even before he gets into office. And certainly the stock market has already voted very fervently in favor of Trump. I was looking at my portfolio in the US and smiling over the past week because it's jumped up significantly. Ditto in the case of cryptocurrency. So I think that those are all wins that people are already taking.
Will the right swing influence Europe to swing more right?
I think that the Europe swinging more right has been happening in spite of what's been happening across in the US. So we've already seen the emergence of, and I don't want to call them far-right governments.
There's nothing far-right in Europe. There really isn't.
They're essentially nationalist governments, and they're interested in actually putting the interests of their countries first and foremost. That's part of the reason why Germany has now fallen. We've already seen that to a large extent happening in a lot of the other countries. So we've had that swing happen in France. We saw it happen in Italy. But of course, the biggest problem is that the EU establishment holds too much power, which is why at the point at which Giorgia Meloni wanted to take specific actions that were against EU policy, they came down on her like a ton of bricks. And one of the things that I'm hoping will come about as a result of this exercise is the destruction of the EU, which has probably been the single most toxic thing for Western civilization. If you have the collapse of the EU, you can have it reverting to what its original intent was,
exactly.
which was it was meant to
trade
be
body.
The European Economic Community was what it was meant to be.
Yeah.
And if you have that, you can have the reemergence of Europe as a power in its own right. But that also means that Germany needs to turn around, which is actually not going to happen in the short term. But under Trump, is he likely to be wanting to dictate the course of individual governments in Europe? No. What he's going to insist on, you guys need to pay us for the fact that we contribute the biggest chunk of your defense.
Yeah, I think also, just to be brief, the whole point is Trump's not going to, the world may move towards Trump, and this is how. It's not because of dictating, this is how you must be. Trump could care less how any other country can be. Yesterday on a WhatsApp group, people were moaning because the Rand had tanked. And
no, the Rand hasn't tanked. Well, the dollar has strengthened against every currency.
Yeah, okay. So, but it depends how you look at it, right? But the Rand went from 17.20 something over the weekend to 18. Fine. And they moaned, Trump. And I just said, it's got nothing to do with Trump. Trump is going to do what is good for America. You as a country can decide to do what is good for your country, right? And that would be to do some of the things Trump is doing, because clearly they work, right? So in South Africa, for example, if we want a strong currency, you don't moan about Donald Trump. You start drilling off the West Coast and you start fracking in the Karoo. Simple.
Which is not going to happen with the DA.
Won't happen with the DA. Less likely to happen with the DA than the ANC. But so that is really, and so Europe will have to make a decision, and I think separate countries in Europe will make those decisions, and over time you may see a shift towards the so-called right. Lurt wanted to know the effect of celebrity endorsements pro and against candidates. Well, Lurt, I think we can very much say that celebrities have actually no sway anymore. It's done. It's over. Nobody cares what celebrities have to say. You are entertainers. Entertain us, and that is what we expect you to do. Taylor Swift had no influence whatsoever. It's just not a thing. We don't care what your politics are. Make music, entertain us. Make movies, entertain us.
But again, we've now discovered that those celebrity endorsements were in fact paid for.
Which even more so just goes to show that, like, there's nothing real. People feel they aren't real in the first place before they even know they paid for. And then after they paid for, that just kind of proves the point, doesn't it? Ken wants to know, do you think he'll release the JFK files?
He's promised to do so, and I think that is going to be a litmus test for him. And so I believe he will do it.
Yeah, I think he will do it. He's also got RFK sitting on his shoulder to do it.
Yes.
So I think it's likely that he'll do it. I think there will be some redaction because he's pointed out that...
Well, he said that the exception would be for people who are still alive,
Yes.
Whose names should not be mentioned. And I take that point.
Yeah, so do I.
One of the other things that people have not been talking about, but which I think he will do, is to actually pardon Snowden and Assange.
Yeah, I'm interested to see if he does that. There's Snowden, Assange, and the guy who made Silk Road, Albrecht. Is it Albrecht? So I'm interested to see if he does those.
Because, the reason why he didn't pardon them before his departure is because he was held hostage by Mitch McConnell.
Yeah.
And McConnell said to him that if you pardon these guys,
we'll impeach you.
Then we'll impeach you.
Yeah, so let's see what happens with those.
And again, people want to know what a neocon is. That's a neocon. Yes. Yeah. So,
swamp monster.
But this time round, he's pathed to, on day one saying, I'm pardoning these guys and I'm bringing them back home.
Yeah. All right. So
he's also going to pardon all of the June 6th people.
Yeah, I think most of them. I think the ones who were shown to be violent, so those who did like physically attack police officers, for example, I don't think he will pardon those ones. But I think everyone else, the people who were just walking through the Capitol, will get pardoned. The Justice Department will also be told to drop all of those cases. They're still prosecuting them as we speak. Sam Macron wanted to talk about all the good work Charlie Kirk and Jack Pacific had done at Grassroots. So I think that's true. They would add it to the list with Scott Presler. Definitely someone like Charlie Kirk went to all the universities and had those sort of open mics with students, asking them why they supported one side or another. Look, that's good work, and I think he did particularly well. There was a lot of criticism of him talking about the Democrat and their ground game, and that Charlie Kirk is just some podcaster. I think proven wrong. So that was good stuff. Normal is boring wants to know, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on how and why the Dems got themselves in such a bind. Yes, Biden was obviously unfit, but to replace him with such a hollow, unlikable person, why? Was there no one else? Honestly, the result was predictable.
Well, I think you spoke to that point.
Yeah, we've discussed that.
They had the rug pulled out.
And I think that's Joe Biden, if you want to know how that happened. And in fact, if you go look, Google Joe Biden election day and go see what she was wearing. Bright red pantsuit. I wouldn't have put it beyond Joe Biden to have put a tick in the Donald Trump box.
And there was, prior to that, there was Joe Biden walking out with a MAGA hat.
Yeah. So definitely no love lost between the Bidens and the Harris household and the Harris campaign. Bridget talks about the role of toxic media. The viral narrative is completely responsible for Trump derangement syndrome, which Sam Harris, I know, still very much has. And the current TikTok hysterical wailing, gnashing of teeth, hair-cutting liberals, they're shaving their heads because Trump got voted in, and the victim mode of the woke left. Media created and fueled this mental health crisis. Yes, they did. They still are. They will still continue to do so. However, I'm old enough to remember 2020, and I'm old enough to even remember 2016. And I can tell you that 2016, the hysteria was way more than it is now, even despite the fact that I think they called him Hitler less often. And remember, in 2016, people were knitting vagina hats, and they were hashtag the resistance. And then there were people with Handmaid's Tale outfits outside the Supreme Court. We haven't really seen that. So we've seen a couple of people, shaving their head on TikTok or Twitter, saying they want to join this, what's it, the 4B movement or something, where they don't have sex with men, and they don't basically they
and my response to that was, well, you're choosing abstinence over promiscuity. That sounds like a win to me.
Yeah, well, it turns out if you don't have sex, you don't need an abortion. So win-win, right? Anyway, I think the media is absolutely to blame, but I think that they're losing their edge, which we've discussed. This is an interesting one. DV wants to know, what do you think should be the first 3 executive orders? Have you got anything off the top of your head?
No, look, he's already spoken to that. He's going to, reinstitute
All the border stuff.
All of the border stuff, the Keystone Pipeline stuff, all of that kind of
So it's the border, it's energy, drilling, basically, drilling and fracking, etc. So it's the border, it's energy, and I agree with both of those because it's just economic growth and makes absolute sense. Also, by the way, we'll make our oil price cheaper, which might reduce, if the rand hasn't lost too much value, it might actually make petrol cheaper. But I'm getting the signal to end it. But yeah, so that's those are the 2, and the third. Any ideas? What would you like him to do?
on day one, I'd like him to issue those pardons as the day one. Yeah. So I'd like him to pardon Assange, to pardon Snowden, and to pardon all of the January 6th. Participants, and actually just put that entire thing to rest once and for all.
Done and dusted.
Yeah. Look, I think by the time we have the next conversation, we're going to have lots more to pick up with. One of the things that we need to touch upon is what happens to the United States in a post-empire world, because Biden has effectively managed to pull out the rug from the U.S. as a global empire. And the U.S. now has to reclaim a position in a multipolar world and assert dominance in that multipolar world, because that's what every country needs to be doing. And how is he going to do that?
Yeah. I'm going to disobey the rules and continue a little bit. There's a whole bunch of questions from a few people just around media asking, around how to... Firstly, why South African media? Johan wants to know why South African media is so vehemently against Trump.
Because they're funded by the Soros empire, fundamentally. And,
so funding is the main answer.
Yes, it's the main answer.
Yeah. And then there's ideologues as well. I think that, I know a fair number of journalists and a fair number of people in that industry, and a lot of them are just ideologues. They just really believe in a lot of these things. And so they've got a loudhailer. And so they shout out the things they believe through the loudhailer. And then M about most people believing Trump is going to cause World War III. And I think we can combine that with a question around, where was it? About talking about to your TDS friends off the ledge from Mo Rabbit. So, how do you sort of speak to people now and tell them, listen, it's actually okay, and the oak's not that bad, and what do you think about this? And did you know that? And how do you go about that?
I heard someone say something very interesting about Trump, which is worth repeating. He said, you must take Trump seriously, but don't take him literally.
Yeah, they've been saying that since 2016.
Yes, and I think it's something very important to consider, that Trump will, descend into a hyperbole at every conceivable opportunity. But when he actually gets down to implementation, it's very specific and it is very nuanced. Well, it's properly negotiated.
Yes, but also a good heuristic for life.
Yes.
Judge people by their actions
and not
by their words.
Absolutely.
And so, frankly, I don't and never really have, although I like a lot of the stuff he says, I never really have cared about what any politician says. Lots of people say things I like. I really care about what they do. And so let's just judge people by their actions. Let's see what he actually does. And so we go from there. I think we have to, unfortunately, to those we didn't get to, I apologize. There was a lot of feedback. We really do appreciate that. As always, thank you for listening. It's been a good one. we're obviously going to have a lot to talk about over time on this topic, Kanthan. 4 years.
4 years. on the assumption that there's not another attempt on his life, because, there was one a couple of weeks ago as well that was intercepted.
Yes. Well, he now has a Secret Service detail about 100 times the size of what it was before he was the president-elect. So hopefully that will actually be able to protect him. And I think some good times ahead. Certainly our listeners probably are less worried than the average person very upset about this. But I very much think that you don't have anything to worry about. I think we are headed to a time of less war, of less conflict in the world, of more economic stability, and generally less craziness. And that's a good thing, even if it only lasts for 4 years.
I think that the world is a better place this week than it was last week. So, before the election. So, I think we're good.
As always, thanks for listening or watching. Like, subscribe, share, all those good things. Really appreciate it. We'll catch you next time. Cheers.
Cheers.